Thanks so much, Dean, for giving me the opportunity to be here with you and having this extremely uplifting conversation. Really, I really feel blessed having you here as somebody to talk to about these things. It really helps.
Yeah. I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, let's welcome Dr. Wolfgang Knorr. He's been joined us before on the podcast. Climate scientist, former climate science manager and editor, turned scientific consultant and science communicator. Let's find out how one of the most heartful and aware climate scientists around today, how he keeps his heart open, how he stays present in the face of our many predicaments. Hey there, and welcome to another round of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And this is going on, I believe it's our 5th year of the Poetry of Predicament, and there have been hundreds and hundreds of interviews. And there has been kind of an evolution and a refinement from my point of view about what we end up talking about, who we end up talking with on this podcast. And today's guest, I'm very excited to be reconnecting with Wolfgang Knorr, who is, amongst many other things, has played a role as a consultant of sorts for Jem Bendell and the formation of what's been come to be known as the Deep Adaptation Forum. And that's been a place where people who are to some degree or another collapse aware can come together to explore this extraordinary time and to have a safe container for what can sometimes be extraordinarily difficult emotions and realizations about what it means to be aware of human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. And that really spans the spectrum of people who believe that, yes, these are all things that will be happening out in the future sometime, and they're concerned about it. And it also includes all the way to the end of the spectrum, which is far more extreme, where there are bundles of people on the internet and Facebook and so on that call themselves the near-term human extinction groups. And so that's sort of the spectrum of concern and urgency that one can find in the collapse-aware community. And back from the near-term human extinction crowd, what I've really enjoyed about my earlier conversations with Wolfgang Knorr is that we've been able to combine his expertise with regard to the things on the more scientific end of the conversation. And we've also explored the very human and very secular and more on the human side, the less academic side, the less scientific side, like the issue of what it is to be a parent in these times. So I've so appreciated, Wolfgang, our conversations about those things. So it's been, I'm guessing, at least a year since we've talked, and there's so much that has occurred. We can't even get near the insanity that's been going on in the USA and around the world with regard to authoritarian politics, which has been putting up a huge amount of smoke and mirrors and obstacles in the way of any real conversations about mitigation, about sustainability, about even deep adaptation. There's just been so much of that kind of insanity going on. Plus, on top of that, the only time in my lifetime that I've ever experienced anything like the epidemic of the COVID stuff that's been going on. So the nature of the conversation, this conversation that you and I have dipped into to speak together in the past, it seems to me like it's changed. And you've sent me some notes in anticipation of our talk. And it sounds like that is true for you as well. From your perspective, you're seeing some rather different elements going on and influencing the conversation that I'm very excited to talk with you about and hear what you where you'd like to take the conversation today. It is there are times when I've literally found myself just my jaw dropped this year. I've lost count of how many times where those influential elements in our world on the societal level, on the public health level, on the environmental level, there are just so many extraordinary changes, and unfortunately not many of them good, not many of them promoting furtherance of life on the planet. So I'm so excited to hear your suggestions for where we might shift our framings, shift our looking, shift literally the narrative, to explore the narrative that has led us up to here, and what you're seeing in terms of how that controlled narrative around the world has changed. And so without further ado, I just really thank you for reaching out. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And thanks for taking the time to speak with us on the poetry of predicament. Welcome here and good to see you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dean. And I'm really, likewise, I'm extremely happy to have the opportunity to talk to you here. And as you say, I completely agree that things are moving. The discussion, the thoughts people have are moving in different directions. And I think that's really the positive side of it all, that we have, people that a lot of people feel that what you just said, that we have developments that we could very much call authoritarian or autocratic, that, tendency to impose one way of seeing things, basically a top-down view. People are starting to rebel against that, and I think that's a very good sign. On the other hand, I also agree that the grip is tightening in a lot of places. There are definitely authoritarian tendencies, democracy or pluralism on politically is going on, worldwide, is actually receding. That, there have been studies looking at that, for example. So there are opposing forces, and in the area where I come from, climate change and also impacts of climate change on ecosystems and all that kind of thing. I used to be an academic working on these things. It's kind of similar. I mean, there is a growing awareness of the scale of the problem, but at the same time, the problem is getting bigger and bigger. So it's really very difficult to say whether there is progress, because the challenge every year that passes is getting bigger. And I think that also applies to the space of narratives, to the opening of the narrative. In a way, the space is getting smaller, but because of tightening grip of top-down policies. On the other hand, there is a growing hunger for different stories around who we are as humanity, how we want to, especially what kind of relationship we want to have to nature, especially that has come back definitely through the pandemic, through discussions about whether this was caused by humans intruding into nature. And yeah.
If I could, I'd like to just put out a little seedling and see if it's of interest to you.
Yeah.
We don't have to go here, but it seems like it might fit here. I recently I did an interview a month or so ago with philosopher and activist Rupert Read from the UK. And we talked a lot about his programs coming up and his book collaboration with Jem Bendell and so on coming up this year. Basically, his main project is Parents for a Future. And so it's quite robust in terms of inviting parents and grandparents to step up in an activist way and support their children, their grandchildren, and so on. You get the idea. And then this, more in-depth edited volume, this book that he and Jem Bendell are putting out, again, really formidable way to let people express about what are the possibilities if we take on the world through a deep adaptation frame. And there was also more recently an article that Rupert Read wrote in response to Michael Mann, who quite famous climate scientist, and in his recent book, Michael Mann's most recent book, he makes a point a number of times in the book of calling out voices that he calls doomers. Jem Bendell would be called a doomer in his book. Rupert Read is called a doomer in his book, and there are a number of other public figures who are quite active in this conversation. And if someone is below a certain, or I guess above a certain threshold of being negative, having a negative framing, negative way of seeing what's going on in the world, then someone like Michael Mann decides to call him out and call him a doomer. And the main point I'm getting at is that it seems like this is somebody on basically the same side of the conversation being extraordinarily critical. And what Michael Mann's interpretation or his conclusion is that a doomer is actually more dangerous to the public conversation, to the public narrative, than a denier, than a climate change denier. So what he's asserting is that if we put out too negative a view of what's going on, that people would be so discouraged that they will basically stop any positive movement or forward movement or hope. And so I'm just curious if that rings a bell for you at all. I'm happy to let that go. I'm covering that in another separate thing, separate sort of article that I'm producing. But I'm wondering if, I don't know if you're familiar with this odd picture that some people talk about sometimes of having a circular firing squad. So if you're in a circle and you're trying to shoot at somebody in the center, chances are a whole lot of people are going to die. And the idea is this is kind of what it's looking like, even on the same side of the conversation of trying to generate positive futures and solutions and so on. And yet we have this extraordinarily corrosive, judgmental conversation going on and calling out going on. And I'm wondering if any of that is real for you, and if you have any comments on that. Or again, I'm happy to let that go and we can get back right on the thread you were on.
I can hear you. I mean, it just happens that I'm currently writing an essay with Rupert about the sanity of calling out emergencies, why we're not really ready for it. I don't want to go into that direction and leave it for the, that once we have that published. But I'm in very close contact with Rupert, and I know about the problems he had, and in fact he passed me a first version of his reply to Michael Mann commenting, so I'm quite familiar with that discussion, and I think there is actually in a way a long history of that, and that long history maybe is important to understand what's going on, and that long history in a way goes back decades. It goes back at least back to the late 1970s when the first climate report came out, the Charney report, it was entirely in the US. It warned of the negative consequences of climate change. Everything was there, everything was set in place. At that time, people were actually quite serious about it. And then suddenly the narrative changed when the fossil fuel industry mainly decided it would be cheaper to basically develop out of the problem, sort of crank on the development machine, and then sometime in the future we figure that out. That was actually more or less a conscious, almost political decision. And then it was cemented with the political change when Ronald Reagan became president, and the whole thing was forgotten, basically. And since then, we've had these continuous client reports and scientists' warnings about, that we're heading up for dangerous future, and the UN Convention then came to pledging to prevent harm to people and ecosystems from dangerous levels of climate change, and all that happened. And it's been 40 years now. And I personally don't believe, that people have different opinion, but I personally don't believe that such a thing as climate policy even exists.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a bold statement, but there is the EU emission trading system, for example, and suddenly it's kind of tightening up, but so far it has been ridiculous, especially the country that I come from, Germany, has a policy that is so full of loopholes that, Germany is falling back on every measure in climate ambition compared to other countries. It's mind-boggling, and the fact that there are policies now that and plans to roll out wind and solar, that's nothing new. Nuclear energy was very much more heavily subsidized in the beginning when it appeared. Fossil fuels are still subsidized. That's not climate policy. And so basically all these warnings have completely evaporated. We now have a slightly changed narrative, but that really came from, in my opinion, mainly the youth strikers, Greta Thunberg and fellow, to some extent, also Extinction Rebellion, but I believe the youth movement is really a deciding one, because they really bring a new narrative. They no political leader, a political leader on average might be 60 years old. My daughter was born in 2015, and by the 1st January 2100, she will be 84. And I know people who are 84 are really fully in their lives. So 2100 for the children of today is not that far, but we'll all be dead by then. So I think that was really a change of narrative, but it wasn't brought by Michael Mann, Rupert Reed, myself, you. It was brought on by the youth movement, and that failure, that total failure of the scientists to change the narrative and actually bring things into action, I completely proves that Michael Mann doesn't have a point there. I believe that he's simply wrong. He thinks that, you know, people have to think positively to bring in change, and you have to give people hope. But if nothing happens, and nothing has happened for 40 years, and the message that, okay, we have to tell you things, you know, look dire, and so please do something. And if that hasn't worked for 40 years, to insist on, you know, turbocharging that message even more, being the only way, is absolutely insane. And in my view, it just proves that scientists have not been trained in storytelling. Scientists usually do not understand that below the scientific method, there is an entire layer of sort of, I would call, narrative technology, sort of, so that, you know, coming from the place, you know, that humans, what makes us human is that we tell stories all the time. And that is sort of the foundation of all culture and science and all that. But scientists have not been trained in reflecting on that, and they don't usually reflect the stories they tell without, you know, outside of the words and their papers. And yes, I disagree with Mann, but I also kind of, well, I don't fully actually agree with all that what deep adaptations say, and then I can see some criticism with doomism that I might even you know, support, but on the whole, I completely regret that this whole discussion between doomists and the other side, which I would like to call technological solutionists, people like Mann, for example, has come to this point and has actually remained very much in this kind of scientific sphere where one side has to prove that, you know, their assumption is being more scientific than the other side. Because I really think that we have to break that open. We have to reflect on what it really means being scientific, for example, or where these scientific questions come from. And all,
well, I'd like to just read out one of the questions that you offered for this conversation, and it's, do you think there's a widespread illusion around what is really being done to address climate change? And perhaps I could add one other piece of another question that you wrote, which is, and is there a way that the IPCC, the way it's structured, the way it works, the way it's gone on for 20 plus years, is there a way that the IPCC is partially responsible for that illusion or delusion that we have about what's actually happening about climate change and other environmental concerns now?
Yes, I think I answered part of the first question already with what I said about, you know, the question of about the existence of a climate policy. I mean, it's definitely debatable. I just what I want to do is actually open a door for discussion and sort of evade the kind of top-down narrative that we're struggling with as humans these days. I'm not saying that I'm right, or, you know, there have been studies that showing actually the effects of climate policy on the course of temperature rise. I mean, they're saying that, you know, we would have avoided by maybe 0.2 degrees, but I personally doubt it. For the reason that I just sketched out. That the other thing is evidence for an illusion taking place is a narrative that I see very much in mainstream media is that it's talking about progress around climate change. And that progress is basically justified by the rise of ambition, of commitments that are being declared by politicians.
Mm.
In a way, that is progress in the ambition, in the ambition space. The problem with that is, how do you define progress? Now, usually, okay, let's think of a patient. If the patient gets sicker, and the doctors in the meantime, agree more on what the therapy should be. Before, had 3 doctors and they were squabbling about what they should do, and then they finally agree. Is that progress when the patient in the meantime got sicker?
Right.
I think nobody would term that progress. So I think that's the situation we have. So we have ramping up of ambitions. Actually, I was just reminded of that back in 2008, I co-published a paper where we discussed at that time ambitions by the then G8 countries, a group of industrialized countries, and what was around the discussion then, that was way before the Paris Agreement, was a 50% reduction of emissions by these countries, so only by the rich countries, not by developing countries, of 50%. I believe it's against 1990 emissions. And now we're talking about 0 by 2050. So that is very much a ramping up of ambition. But that ramping up of ambition also has, and now we're getting back into the parallel with the patient, has very serious side effects, because it means because we can't go down to 0 emission by 2050. That became quite clear in the recent years by economic modeling. So we would have to come up with fancy technologies that soak up huge amounts of CO2, take it out of the air, and put them back into rocks, basically, into geologic formations. Well, first of all, that technology doesn't exist, and maybe at very small scale and experimentally, but it doesn't really exist, because where it exists, then it's actually used for advanced oil recovery, ironically. So you're producing even more fossil fuels. But even worse, and that's kind of, it's like a serious drug you're taking, and which makes you even sicker than you were before, is that this net zero thinking has already led the European Union to classify wood chips as carbon neutral, which is completely insane. It's actually not true.
Yes.
And the absolute craziest thing that really hurts me personally, because I feel very connected to nature and forests, and they're cutting down forests within nature reserves in the Baltic countries, which are EU members, and burn that wood in formerly coal-fired power stations. Mm-hmm. And it's insane. And it's one of these examples where this linear narrative, even the narrative by activists, doesn't help. Because in the end, it was the discovery of coal that stopped the deforestation in Europe. We have in Europe and in the US as well, especially in the East Coast, you have massive amounts of regrowing forests because of coal. And the narrative of a lot of environmentalists, coal is bad and renewables are great, is correct in some ways, but there are sort of twisted ways where it's not correct. So the question is much broader than just CO2.
Right. So
and
if I could just...
That's the illusion, maybe. That's the illusion, is the question is wrong.
Right. We've just landed in the center of the place where I was when I named my book The Impossible Conversation. Because, you know, when I saw, I'm not a scientist and so on, but I dived deep into learning how to learn, to at least be conversant about the issues that you're talking about. And what I landed on quite early was that the entire conversation, the entire narrative that's called what our big issue is climate change. To me, that is actually a controlled narrative that shows just a small fraction of the whole picture that you're closer to describing right now, that whole picture. It is so much more than the count of CO2 parts per million and so on. What we're actually looking at is that industrialized culture is itself a heat engine, and it doesn't matter which fuel source we use, that we are generating heat, and we are so overshooting the Earth's ability to sustain our productivity. And we're so over polluting in the name of like the greenhouse gases that we're putting into the air and so on, that we can't seem to reduce it even a small amount. And I'm thinking of a guy that professor out of the University of Utah, a guy named Tim Garrett, who speaks just beautifully about this particular point, that it is a farce to think that we can keep the essential core of our industrialized model of humanity on this planet, and especially a growth-based model, and have any chance of avoiding really dire circumstances in a relatively short period of time. So I'm completely with you, and I'm curious if anything I've just mentioned is useful on the thread you were talking about.
No, thank you. It absolutely is. I mean, even from a first standpoint, of course, we know that societies that overgrow their capacities usually collapse. We know that from history or ecology and all that. But that's one element. But it's, well, it's also, I mean, I personally don't know what's gonna, I don't have a good feel what of the direction we're heading, to be honest. I don't have a good feel for how vulnerable our society actually is even to climate change. I've been a researcher of climate impact on especially ecosystems, and I still don't have a good feel of what, you know, and what impact climate change is going to have on things like food supply. I mean, I once had a PhD student who did some modeling. He used a vegetation model to model the impact of climate change on crops, and he used some data from field experiments and all that kind of things. And I've also read the latest IPCC report on that, and I don't have a very good feeling for what direction we're heading and how big the impact really is going to be. But what I can see is, if we continue the logic of our current civilization that is totally valuing expansion, sees everything that is in the way of increasing the speed of turnover of things, anything, you know, I mean, usually it's called capitalism, but it's just, you know, I can't really prove that scientifically. It's just a gut feeling that it just can't go well. And if we look at climate change, for example, and fossil fuels and net zero and all that kind of narrative, then we're just treating a symptom. And because if we, you know, we already have technologies that could take the CO2 back out of the atmosphere. And theoretically, if we dedicated something like 35% of global GDP to doing that, we could do that actually, and which is about what the US spent during World War II and just after that on the war. So it's not impossible, but the problem is, well, it's not going to happen, of course, and it's second, the damage being done might be just as big as, you know, similarly big as actually war. And the third is, once we've done that, something else is going to keep growing out of proportion, and the next thing, it's basically like a cancer. You know, you just you do chemotherapy, wipe it out here, and then it goes back on the other somewhere else.
Right.
So unless we treat the core of the problem, which is really in the narrative, is in the way we think that our mission is somehow to outsmart and outgrow, you know, anything that confines us, then we'll just keep on doing that and get,
Yeah.
you know,
I'm
get more and more unhappy in a way. That
yes. It seemed like another one of the questions that you sent over as a suggestion. It seems like it might be a good point to just ask you what you mean by a possible new science of nature connectedness and human vulnerability, because it seems like what you're pointing at is how deeply flawed the current business as usual way of and humanity's way of interacting with Earth and with each other is as totally separate entities, and really everything is commodified. And there is, if there's one thing that the marketplace hates the most, it's to be vulnerable, it's to be uncertain, it's to allow any kind of mystery to show up, and definitely to not in any way consider ourselves in relationship with Earth and with nature, but to be commodifying it, to be parsing it up, to be able to translate it into profit. That's clearly the center of how we operate on a global scale. And so I'm wondering if you could say anything more about this possible generation of an alternative way for science to interact. And really, it sounds to me like you're pointing for us all to interact with a science of nature connectedness and human vulnerability. Can you say more about that?
I think that really nicely brings us back to one of the previous questions, was about what the role of the IPCC was in this. And I really think that, yeah, well, that's what I want to say. I completely agree that sort of vulnerability is being avoided, and you can actually see it in the IPCC structure. I recently noticed that the IPCC, maybe I'm deviating a bit, but I will come back. The IPCC has 3 working groups. The first one is totally about the physical problem. That's about the framing, so it's basically seen as a physical problem. And then it has it has second working group that is more about how that physical problem interacts with society, and also includes the reaction of society back sort of in terms of adaptation to climate change. And then it has another working group that is about mitigation. So in a way, that's baked in this is already, you have a working group that looks at mitigation, so how we can actually avoid the problem, that is separated from the adaptation, which is, I found that really interesting, because it kind of sends the message, okay, we can actually do it. We can mitigate, and then we will not have the problem, and then actually we don't need to worry about adaptation. So there's no interaction, because obviously if you adapt, then the amount of mitigation, and these correspond, and it's baked into the system. It's a separate working group, and that's why, and also because of the central place, that's not by coincidence, that's called working group 1 is a physical system. So the whole thing is seen as a physical problem. Mm-hmm. One thing the IPCC could do, or maybe we need a kind of people's IPCC or something like that, mm-hmm. Sort of grassroots IPCC alternative.
A citizens assembly.
Yes, PCC. Yeah, exactly. Actually, I'm working with a group of scientists, and we're trying to bring that into the discussion, actually. But citizen assembly, and I personally think it's not going further. I would like to have citizen science. I would actually like to break open the academic barrier and have a citizen science. And the IPCC having people from the general public there taking part in the science assessment, even. That's my personal opinion. We would right. really profit from that. But anyway, I think that that vulnerability, I agree with you there, that is really being avoided by the current framing. And we really need to break that open. We need to break open a lot of barriers to who is allowed to take part in the discussion. And then really look at, well, one thing is look at our vulnerability, mm-hmm. and then at the kind of, at the very basic, reflect on that very basic narrative of growth, and that it's a relationship to nature, and also how we feel about that. Because I really, you go ahead.
Can I just take one more cut at that? Go back a couple of minutes to the conversation about Michael Mann and him accusing doomers of being more destructive than deniers. And that particular part of the narrative that he represents, it seems like it might just fit here in your point about needing a science of nature connectedness and human vulnerability. Because what I'm hearing someone like Rupert Reed or any of Jem Bendell and so on, who are called out by someone like Michael Mann, they're being called out because they're suggesting that it would be a good idea to exercise what I would call the precautionary principle. Like, what if what we're headed toward is inevitable collapse of Earth and human systems that are being caused by human beings? What would be some of the dynamics, and what would be some of the ways in which we would want to process that together, feel that together, be aware of that together? That's what I assert is someone like Rupert Reed, Jem Bendell, and so on, these people that Michael Mann is calling out as too doomerish, too negative, too aggressive, and eliminating hope. It seems like there is, you use the word vulnerability and you use the word connectedness. And what I know, I've been involved with the deep adaptation community since its inception, and quite deeply. And this is the whole nature of my body of work, is actually deeper still than deep adaptation. I think this goes right to the heart of you using the word vulnerability and connectedness, because part of the core of my work is what got us into this predicament is that we've disconnected from all the sources of meaning and relationship in human life. And I call those deeper self. We've disconnected from other people, we've disconnected from earth, and even disconnected from soul. And so there is no more vulnerable place than to be able to crack our hearts open and to realize we have caused this. We're causing the collapse. We're causing it's dinner table conversation that we're causing the 6th mass extinction. It's extraordinary, the cognitive dissonance that's going on, that someone like Michael Mann, who is he's an extraordinarily smart man, and ironically, he's been attacked, literally death threats for years now for his hockey stick model, which was a way of representing our damage to the planet. So it's just this layer upon layer of crazy, of cognitive dissonance, of craziness, of this circular firing squad attacking one another when we're really wanting the same things. It's extraordinary to me. So I see some glimmer, not so much of hope necessarily, but I see a glimmer of healing or sanity when you use the word connectedness and vulnerability with the word science. So would you be willing to say some more about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. The case of Michael Mann is really unfortunate. It is unfortunate that we need to have this confrontation, maybe between sort of optimistic and pessimistic outlook, and I just hope that, you know, at some stage that we will be able to move the conversation on to a point where more people realize that, you know, the biggest danger is not doomism or optimism or doomism, is actually just carrying on what we've been doing. So and hopefully, you know, scientists like Mann will be able to subscribe to that at some point. And I mean, I can only agree with you that, you know, we have really completely disconnected ourselves from so many things that we really are, you know, our nature, not nature, but who we really are as natural beings, to our hopes and aspirations and our soul, as you say, from what's going on behind us. So as you say, you can have a dinner table conversation with a 6th extension and then dig into your steak, you know, and you know, have no connection whatever between what your left hand and your right hand does, or whatever, you know, or your brain and your stomach, and I completely agree with that. And I think that the starting point to any change here should be to realize that disconnect. And I have to confess to that as well. And a sign of hope was actually, I saw what excerpts from Michael Mann's book, actually, where he actually did confess himself to, you know, being in some form of denial, if I remember correctly. So he was, I thought he was quite outspoken about his own limitations. So I think this maybe just needs a little bit of nudging, that we could actually open this whole thing up and then realize that the underlying theme is that disconnect from nature. And then once you more into the nature connectedness, then doom or positive and negative outlooks, they're just two opposite poles of what always happens in nature, because nature is a building force and is a destructive force at the same time. And I think indigenous cultures know that very well, that nature is not benign or bad. It's both. And so that the whole discussion just resolves once we realize, we go further back to our roots and then make that a science. What I mean with that is that bring it into the public discourse, bring it into the mainstream, and open the mainstream up out of that one-dimensional problem solution framework, and anything that is against a solution to a problem is taboo, and it's sometimes it's absolutely ridiculous what you read in mainstream media, how much humans should adapt to new technologies, rather than technologies being adapted to humans, and we should really reflect on that, and then go one step further. What is it that we really want? What kind of life do we want to lead? And in antiquity, there wasn't that thing like this is science and this is social science, or there was philosophers. And the main thing, one of the main things philosophers used to do 2000 years ago was to think about the good life. How is, and it was totally natural to these people. And we lost all that. We don't spend any time about that. What is, ethics? Who should we be? Who are we? Who would you want we be? What kind of life do we want to lead? We just I really think we're like drugged. It's in the epidemic, you can see that there's a problem, there's a solution, and then we listen to the leaders. That's what we do, and we do that. We just respond. We never sit down and reflect. And that's really quite unusual for a civilization. I'm pretty sure, I know that I don't know much about indigenous cultures, and there must be millions, now there are thousands or whatever, but I don't think they do that. I don't think that people in even a few hundred years ago did that, but I think we completely drugged. And actually what you described to me about the disconnect, about all these levels, that sounds psychotic to me. I'm not a psychologist, but it really is a description of a deep psychological disease.
Yes, no question. I'm with you completely.
And as long as we don't realize that, and don't realize how deeply steered we are by others telling us what to do, and we think that we live in pluralistic societies, but you just need to, a little nudge, and you're basically Nazism or communism.
Yes.
In our current societies, and I guess you could see that in the US play out.
Absolutely.
And in Europe, we have Hungary now is been declassified as a democracy, and the EU they don't do anything against it. It's really scary.
I'd like to just mention two sources, two people that are amongst a handful that I'm including quite a bit in this body of work, which is on my website, livingresilience.net, and then on the programs page, which is called Deep Academy. What I'm trying to put together is a series of online video learning series that are then supported by support group meetings on a very regular basis, where a person can come in and be at the very beginning of the conversation, just starting their awakening to this, to being collapse aware, to being aware of human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. And if, you know, at the very beginning, we're starting to address the kind of questions that you and I are talking about here. And this, for some people, is the very first time they've ever thought about these issues and the systemic nature of what we're doing in terms of the damage to the Earth and so on. In the more advanced levels of this Deep Academy program, we go into the stronger sources of information and solid sense making of this world. Because I think what you were just describing so well is a world in which the average person has zero sense making ability. We're truly in a pathological, ecocidal, genocidal state. And it's not, I agree with you, it's not looking good. So what I've been in search of is strong voices of clarity, for not necessarily that I agree with them politically or I agree with them about their particular social science perspective or whatever, which I usually do, but it's really going for their ability to articulate how to start making sense in this world, how to be able to find a truth inside of ourselves. And that takes work. It's like, if I decide I'm going to run a marathon, I need to practice running. We need to practice sense making. And most human beings on the planet don't have a clue how to make good sense of what's going on. And it's only after doing some considerable sense making that we can make good choices. And I loved what you said, gosh, I'm guessing a half an hour ago now. You mentioned the possibility of creating citizens' assemblies so that people could actually be a part of these unbelievably critical issues that just have not been served well for 40 years by the corporate interests, the government interests, and even the scientific interests. That it just hasn't worked for a number of reasons. And I love the idea of breathing fresh energy into something like a citizens' assembly, which of course would mean that those citizens would need to get some training in how to make sense, how to engage in open and engaging conversations, and also engage the skill of sense making.
No, I really love what you said. You know, most people will probably think, okay, there is a citizens' assembly now on climate change, let's say, that similar to the one in France. Now, and then, okay, these people out there, they're not specialists, so they should probably receive some training in climate science. But what you're suggesting is the complete opposite. And my hunch is actually that the kind of training that you mentioned would be even more necessary the higher somebody is up in the ranks of expertdom and officialdom.
Yes.
And that's exactly what I see among my colleagues. There are sort of different sorts of scientists, and naturally, they're the ones who like to be in their labs and toil away and produce results, or go out in the field and do their field work. And they're the ones who like to be part of the IPCC and even like advisors to, you know, politicians and all that. So the ones who like the limelight more. And my experience is that, you know, the ones that are sort of more sort of withdrawn in a way, when you ask them, what do you think about this you know, the Paris Agreement, all these climate goals, and they will say, yeah, I mean, this is all good, but it's just not possible. I mean, it's insane. We just, whereas once somebody is more invested in the, you know, in the current system, and then you can see that even with scientists, then yeah, but you know, you can't really say that. Yeah, we really don't know. I mean, yeah, we have all that technology and all that, and I'm not saying that's not true or what is true and what is not true, but being aware that what you take for granted tomorrow might not be anymore.
Mhm.
That's a form of nature connectedness, but because that's how it is in nature. You know, think of the tsunami of when it was 2004 that wiped out how many people? I don't remember. It was close to 500,000 or
Right.
something.
Mhm.
And some people think, oh no, there's no God or something, but that's nature as well. You know, nature is, you know, it's a force, different. You know, it's a force of destruction and creation, and we're forgetting that. And then if we confront it, maybe with the destruction that we caused ourselves, but we are also part of nature. So in a way, we're a bit like a weed or an invasive species that has suddenly colonized this planet, and we creating exponentially rising CO2 emissions, which would exactly be what sort of a culture of bacteria that grows without limits would do. That they would create CO2 emissions that grow exponentially. So we are a natural force in a way, and we are ourselves a destructive force. And if you don't realize that, and you can't realize that when you have to write grant applications for finding solutions to a problem,
Right.
then I'm afraid they're not going to make a good contribution to the discussion that we need. And that's exactly why we need citizens, we need ordinary people to get in there. And
yeah, it seems like I'm wondering if this is a good time to mention another one of your questions that really grabbed me. And that is, you know, we've both been engaged with Jim Bendel's organization, the Deep Adaptation Network, and so on, the forum and the Facebook group, and so on. And you you mentioned that you have an experience of some progress that's occurred by including the notion of deep adaptation in the conversation at large. And I'm wondering what you think could be done to deepen those benefits of including the deep adaptation conversation in this mix. Is there a way to deepen it? Is there a way to make the deep adaptation conversation more present in the conversation and more valuable?
maybe one thing to clarify is, you know, the discussion that deep adaptation seems to have kicked off, not internally, but externally, is that discussion whether there is scientific evidence for, you know, relatively short-term collapse,
Mm-hmm.
without actually there being much of discussion what we actually mean by collapse. So that, and I think the fact that that kind of got stuck in a way, and you've got reactions to that, and not only by Ackermann, by the way, but also, you know, from people who've been around Extinction Rebellion, for example. So that that having got stuck there is a sign maybe that you're right, that it might need a little bit of deepening, because it's not a scientific question really. It's not about
Right.
how likely collapse is. I don't think we know. I mean, one of the things that I have published on also in conversation pieces is that we scientists just don't know. And we've identified those tipping points and things that can go wrong, but we just don't know how vulnerable the climate system is, and that's not maybe the main point. Maybe the main point is how vulnerable we are in our human system. I think that might actually I think personally that we could actually go a bit further than that still. And first of all, accept, we already talked about that collapse is a natural thing. It's just part of nature. Things grow and collapse again and then make space. That's why we're mortal. There's no other reason why we should be mortal. We're mortal to make way to the new generation. And hence the power, as I'm repeating myself, hence the power of Greta Thunberg in the discussion. It's a deep power. Or at
So
least
I'm curious, when you're saying it's powerful, does that connect up with the words you used before about a different issue about connectedness and vulnerability?
Yes.
When I think about deep adaptation, I think of what's valuable to me about the whole notion of deep adaptation is that it is speaking what is tremendously obvious to me, that we're in the midst of, depending on how privileged our country is, where we happen to be sitting, but around the world, we are in the midst of human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. And it's quite obvious to me that we are a very short distance away from massive more collapse in both Earth and human systems. And so deep adaptation, where its power is for me, is that it is just allowing that through the precautionary principle, just saying, what if this is so? What if we are in collapse now and we have much bigger examples of collapse coming soon? How might we feel about that? How might we be human with one another in the face of, oh my gosh, this is the largest example of collapse and predicament that humanity's ever seen? How can we be together in such a way as to face this with more courage and more heart and more humanity? That's to me where the depth of the deep adaptation communication and conversation comes in. And I can't help but include the two words that you included earlier about a slightly different point, our connectedness and our vulnerability. You've just mentioned a couple of times how you could suggest taking the deep adaptation conversation even deeper. Can you say what that might look like?
Okay, I agree with you that, we need that discussion about the collapse that we're already causing, the collapse that we might face, because, as you say, I mean, the precautionary principle demands it, and it's also natural to know that, nothing is eternal, and to prepare. That maybe the deepening could come from seeing that totally from the perspective of the natural forces that I already mentioned, the natural forces of destruction and creation, and what the reason for that might be. Maybe there's a deeper sense in us causing that, and maybe the way out of that crisis, this crisis of identity that we have talked about, to get out of that crisis, maybe we need some kind of collapse, and there's no other way. And the higher our consciousness is, or better we prepare, the better we might emanate from that. And it also will not be in vain, because if we don't have that change in consciousness, about who we are and what we create. And the forces that we depend on, if that catastrophe is unavoidable, then it will at least have some sense. There's some meaning in it. Well, that's maybe the most general I could say, because I can't even say that we will as humanity will even reappear from that crisis.
Right.
But
right.
but we should also plan for that. We shouldn't,
Mm-hmm.
and and then that raises the question: is the collapse? I mean, is that really the worst case scenario? And then oftentimes I think the worst case scenario is not that. The worst case scenario is a non-collapse in a way. The worst case scenario is continuation of our current trajectory, which would mean that, yes, there will be collapse for a lot of people, but there will be a core of civilization that is highly technological and will just isolate itself from everything. And and the end result would be the complete decoupling of humanity from nature, because there will be no nature left. And for me, that is the worst case scenario. That really is death to me, and not us growing and collapsing and then maybe something else growing.
Yeah. If I could ask you to just pause for a moment. You've just said that so concisely and clearly and almost poetically. I just want to give that clear statement some space to really land in my own system, in my own heart. Yeah. This is very similar to the pivot point when I had researched my book and written it, and really needed to just express what I thought the impossible conversation really meant, like what makes it impossible. And you've just so beautifully mapped out that space. And I just have to say I agree with you, and that's really why I put together the work that I have, which is to be as fully human and alive and vibrant and creative and connected as possible, no matter what the projection that I have in front of me. You might be seeing something at a gigantic scale happening 10 years out, and I might see something at 2100. It doesn't matter in this space. What matters is what's the quality of our relatedness, what's the quality of our aliveness, what are the qualities of sense making and choice making, and then relationship with self, others, earth, and soul that we're making, with really very little to do with how many years do I project until some huge collapse or something. It really becomes kind of a moot point. And what becomes most important is who we are together, the quality of our presence, the quality of our relationships. I guess I've just said something that sort of puts a bow on it, puts a finishing touch on where I stand in this conversation. I'm wondering if you have a way that you'd like to just kind of summarize where you are now, what you're seeing now, what your what is most on your heart now?
No, I think you really touched on it in what you just said, is that in all those discussions, starting from the climate system and then coming all the way to the questions of who we really are, that ancient question, the answer is, what counts is now. And it applies to even to the issue of mitigating the climate crisis, all that, we have to act now. It doesn't matter what we discuss about what we want to do by 2030, 2050 or whatever, as we can see it in the media and in the talk of politicians, to what you just said about, the human condition. And it's a quality of, of our connectedness as humans that counts. That should be above all, and everything else should really be in service to that. And right now it's just upside down, and deep down, I think people know that. Ordinary people know that. They just need to be made aware of what's happening, and they should be protected in a way from the forces of seduction and because they're being we're all being manipulated to be consumers, to be materialists, and you don't need to become deeply religious or something, and then you turn to spirituality or all that. That's not necessary. You just live a normal life, and the way I think through the centuries has always been considered a normal life. That's all we need to do, and there's so many things we don't need that we're being told that we need for that normal life, and it's really so trivial in a way.
Mm. Yeah. Well, Wolfgang Knorr, I can feel our time together drawing to a close. We've both taken some long dips into some pretty strong and profound territory in this conversation. And I'm curious if you have any last words that you'd like to share with people, particularly people for whom this conversation is a bit new and perhaps hard to understand all at once. Any last words for folks who are trying to understand, trying to get a sense of how the world is this way now? Any suggestions, any thoughts, any last minute sharing?
I know that there's been very much of this discussion about hope. Do we need hope, and do we need tell people they should have hope, or what kind of hope? And what I sense more and more is that yes, we do need hope, and it's totally natural to want hope. And it's not bad to have false hopes, because that's also very natural. As long as you retain a balance. And in the end, I think the hope is really in that being human now. I think once we really get into that space, that we will feel hopeful by itself, no matter what happens.
Well, again, Wolfgang Knorr, it's just always a wonderful thing when I get to explore this territory with someone as very, very human and open-hearted as you are, and coupled with an extraordinary intimate knowledge of some of these critical issues, the environmental issues and the scientific issues and so on. It's a remarkable combination, and I feel blessed that I get to have a conversation with you from time to time to look deeply into both of those parts of what it is to be a person in this world, and particularly to be you in this world. So thank you again for spending time with us.
Thanks so much, Dean, for giving me the opportunity to be here with you and having this extremely uplifting conversation. Really, I really feel blessed having you here as somebody to talk to about these things. It really helps.
Yeah. Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.